Hello everybody and welcome to this detailed video on AQA English Language Paper 1 Question 2. If you want the short animated version, I'll link that in the description. Question 2 assesses the language element of Assessment Objective 2 to explain, comment on and analyse how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers using relevant subject terminology to support their view. Now in this exam, what we mean by language is pointed out in the bullet points of the question, a writer's use of words, phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms. But this exam is not about spotting literary devices, it's about writing about the effect in a manner which is precise and contextualised. And what's really interesting is that the mark scheme points out you can only get a level 2, that's half marks at best, if you write about the effect in a manner which is vague and generalised. Something like this is powerful, or it draws you in, or it grabs the reader's attention, or paints a picture in the reader's head. These kinds of comments, which are so vague they could be applied to any quotation, are not going to get you very far in this exam. To get above half marks, you need to write about the effect in a precise and contextualised way, and that's what we're going to look at in detail in this video. So let's look at a typical question, and you can download the extract I'm using through following the links in the description, absolutely free of charge. And the idea behind this video is it's a sort of walking, talking mock, so you might want to attempt the question and see how you do, and I'll do the same. Look in detail at this extract from lines 7 to 15 of the source. How does the writer use language here to describe the narrator's journey? You could include the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, sentence forms, 8 marks. Now it's worth pointing out that you don't have to cover all 3 bullet points. In fact, in the November 2018 paper, the examiner's report pointed out that there were no sentence forms worthy of analysis in that particular extract of the text. So the key thing about these 3 bullet points is that you could write about all 3, but you don't have to. As an 8-mark question, you really only want to spend around 10 minutes on question 2, and yet many students spend way longer because there are just so many different examples you could write about. However, you don't have to write about everything you find. Obviously, if you spend too long on this relatively low mark question, you're going to run out of time on the longer, higher mark questions to come, so keep an eye on the clock and don't go over around 10 minutes. So the key to this question is to be specific about the effects the writer's language choices have, or explain a reason behind the writer's choices, and your comments have to be specific to the text. One way to do this is to read the extract and ask yourself, what is the specific effect the writer is trying to achieve? I think trying to put a word or phrase on it can be really helpful in avoiding vague and generalised comments. For example, perhaps the writer uses language to reveal something key about a character, how they're sinister or vulnerable or excited or powerful. And it's not necessarily only one thing. An extract might use contrasting positive and negative language to symbolise the contrast between a character's dreams and their reality. So let's look at the extract and ask ourselves, what is the specific effect the writer's trying to achieve here? That walk back was a nightmare. I was obliged to go step by slow step for fear of veering off onto the marsh and then into the rising water. If I looked up or around me, I was at once baffled by the moving, shifting mist, and so on I stumbled, praying to reach the house which was farther away than I had imagined. Then, somewhere away in the swirling mist and dark, I heard the sound that lifted my heart, the distant but unmistakable clip-clop of the pony's hooves and the rumble and creak of the trap. So Keckwick was unperturbed by the mist, quite used to travelling through the lanes and across the causeway in darkness, and I stopped and waited to see a lantern, for surely he must carry one, and half wondered whether to shout and make my presence known in case he came suddenly upon me and ran me down into the ditch. So what effect is the writer looking for here? Well, of course there's more than one possible answer, but I would certainly say that language is used to make the narrator's journey seem chaotic and unsettling. And once you're clear on that effect, then you can pick out words, phrases, language features and techniques and sentence forms that create that effect. So why not pause the video now and have a go at that? What do we mean by these bullet points? Well, by words and phrases, we're literally looking for any moment where the writer seems to have chosen a particular word or group of words for a specific reason, where a different word or phrase would have been fine, but they've chosen that one, perhaps for its deeper meaning or connotations, the associations or additional meanings that a word or phrase carries beyond its literal or primary definition. So if we look at our extract, that walk back was a. Is there anything there that seems to be chosen for effect? Is there anything that creates that sense of chaos or the journey being unsettled? Well, no. The writer's just explaining what is going on. No words seem to be chosen for effect yet. But then we get to this. Nightmare. Now that's a deliberate choice, isn't it? The writer could have just written that walk back was tough, but the word nightmare is chosen for a specific reason. And it's an example of figurative language, which is what bullet point 2 is all about, language features and techniques. It's an exaggeration or hyperbole that amplifies the difficulty and chaos of the journey back. By choosing the word nightmare, the writer instills a sense of dread and extreme discomfort, helping the reader to empathise more deeply with the ordeal experienced. And it's a metaphor, isn't it? Because the journey was not literally a nightmare. Now, when you're picking out words and phrases, you do have to make sure they're contextualized to the text you're analysing. You cannot get above half marks without being contextualized, so you mustn't just think about connotations of words without a consideration of context. An example would be if you were going to write about the word trap in this phrase, the rumble and creak of the trap. Now here, a pony and trap is a vehicle, a light carriage pulled by a pony, but some students might take the word trap out of context, thinking of its other meaning as if it has connotations of being caught or ensnared, but we must analyse language whilst considering context. In other words, that's not what trap means here. Another element of contextualized analysis is making sure that what you write makes sense with what we know about the rest of the text. This point has come up in 2 past exam reports. For instance, in our extract, focusing solely on the positive light imagery of the lantern and concluding that the narrator's journey is overall positive would be a misinterpretation. This narrow view disregards the overwhelming sense of fear and being unsettled and the chaos and disorientation conveyed in the rest of the text. The passage predominantly depicts a treacherous and anxiety-filled experience marked by the narrator's struggle, so we must consider the extract in the question in its entirety. Now, to be precise in our answer, it's a good idea to analyse individual words or short phrases. If you feel tempted to quote a whole sentence or long section of text, ask yourself which specific word or short phrase in that quotation achieves the effect I'm writing about, and then just quote that. A common issue mentioned in several exam reports is the tendency of students to select overly lengthy examples for language analysis, and this approach often leads to a focus on paraphrasing and discussing broader ideas rather than a precise analysis of language. Examiners have noticed that students often achieve greater success when they concentrate on shorter phrases or individual words, as this allows for a much more focused and detailed exploration of language effects. Using long quotations frequently results in an analysis that veers towards content rather than language, as students get caught up in the narrative rather than the linguistic choices of the writer. Now let's look at this second sentence. I was obliged to go step by slow step for fear of veering off onto the marsh and then into the rising water. What might you pick out here, if anything? Well, you might think it's a good idea to pick out the word fear, because clearly it's a word linked to the chaos and unsettling nature of the journey, but there's an issue here, especially for those of you aiming for high marks. Picking out words that are difficult to analyse beyond their literal meaning makes it hard to access the higher levels of the mark scheme. This kind of word doesn't really have a deeper meaning or connotation, so we might end up just writing a paraphrase, something like, the writer uses the word fear to show the journey is frightening. And using synonyms or sort of paraphrasing is not what this question is about. The November 2022 exam report pointed out how some students would select a reference, but rather than explaining the effect, would paraphrase the quotation itself. So quite often a student will find a promising quotation, but not be able to explain the effect or the reason behind the writer's choices. Let's look at an example. The writer uses a semantic field of confusion, describing how the narrator was at once baffled by the moving, shifting mist, which means they were confused by the mist which was changing. And what's happened here is the student seems to be onto something, having realised there's this semantic field being used by the writer and quoting an example. For those who don't know, a semantic field is a group of words all to do with a specific topic. But when it comes to writing about the effect, the student has failed to explain anything at all. And this question is all about effect, because spotting and defining a device isn't enough. You have to explain the effect or the reason behind the writer's choices. Now, as I said, language features and techniques means figurative language, the kinds of things you look at in English literature, metaphors, similes, personifications, that kind of thing. However, we do need to be careful here. The summer 2022 exam report pointed out that some students seemed to spot a particular language feature that was very complex, but couldn't write about its effect. We can be so good at spotting similes, metaphors, that kind of thing, but just spotting and defining devices is not what this question is about. It's about writing about their effect. If you can't write about the effect or the reason behind the writer's choices, it's best to choose a different example to analyse. For example, in our source we have the phrase clip-clop, and we might think, oh, this is alliteration and onomatopoeia, I'll write about that. But just because you spot something doesn't mean it's the best thing to write about. There's always way more in the extract than you can write about in around 10 minutes, so you need to think, can I analyse the effect or explain a reason behind the writer's choices? And you might look at that example of alliteration and onomatopoeia and think, no, I can't. So in that case, you'd be much better off looking for a different piece of evidence to analyse. And that's come up in a couple of exam reports now, so just because you spot some figurative language, don't write about it unless you can explain the effect or the reason behind the writer's choices. Finally, we have sentence forms, and at its simplest, this is about whether the writers used any particularly long or short sentences for effect. But again, it's not just have they used any long or short sentences, but in the context of this question, does the writer's use of sentence length have any connection to the effect of the journey being unsettled and chaotic? And if not, we're not going to write about it. Right, so why not pause the video and see what you would highlight or underline in the extract, and let's imagine you might go through and pick out the following: nightmare, moving, shifting mist, praying, swirling mist and dark, clip-clop, rumble and creak, darkness. Well, what we don't want to try and do is write about all 7 of those quotations in a question which is 10 minutes from start to finish. We'd end up rushing all of the analysis, writing perhaps 1 or 2 lines on each one if we're lucky. The 2018 exam report pointed out you don't actually gain marks for the amount of language devices you spot, but for the quality of your analysis. Now, there's no hard or fast rule here about how much you should write or how many quotations you should cover, but the top level of the mark scheme includes the descriptor detailed analysis, so you want to explore in as much detail as you can why that specific language feature is chosen. And that leads us to the question, which ones should I write about? Well, a simple idea here is to think, which ones can I offer the most perceptive, detailed, impressive analysis of? And again, that will be different from person to person, but this approach would help me dismiss clip-clop, because even though it's alliteration and onomatopoeia, it's perhaps hard to pin down the effect. But I might choose to write about nightmare, because the connotations and deeper meaning are clear. Now, obviously, the whole process should be quick. You want to get writing, so practice this time and time again to get comfortable with it. So I'm going to first write about this opening sentence because I think I can write a detailed and perceptive analysis of the connotations of the word nightmare and the fact that it is a short sentence. I've got a clear idea of the effect of the language, and I'm going to explain that in detail. So here's what I might write. The writer employs sentence length and metaphor to describe the journey as chaotic and unsettling. This part of the extract starts with a short, blunt sentence: that walk back was a nightmare. The short sentence feels abrupt and direct, stripping away any excess detail to present the stark reality of the ordeal. There's no room for ambiguity here, and the simplicity of the sentence brings about the sense that this is not hyperbole. The metaphorical use of nightmare extends beyond simple discomfort. It suggests the all-consuming and frightening nature of a bad dream, implying a journey fraught with dangers that are both real and psychologically overwhelming. Okay, so that's a good start. And now I'm going to choose another thing to write about, and again I'm going to go with something that has meaning beyond the surface level. The writer's use of dark and darkness is a calculated choice to emphasize the unsettling nature of the narrator's journey. These words do more than depict the physical setting, they carry additional weight by symbolizing the fear and uncertainty that unsettles the narrator. This approach amplifies the sense of disorientation experienced during the journey. The recurring motifs of dark and darkness act as cues, reflecting the psychological turmoil and unpredictability faced by the narrator. The darkness symbolizes not just the absence of light, but also the absence of clarity and assurance in the narrator's path. By doing so, the writer skillfully intertwines the physical journey with a psychological ordeal, enhancing the complexity and depth of the narrator's experience. So hopefully you can see how this answer's come about. I've asked myself, what is the specific effect the writer's trying to achieve? Then I've picked out all the words and phrases, language features and techniques and sentence forms that achieve that effect. Then I've looked back through those and chosen which ones to write about and explored and analysed them in as much detail as possible, and spending about 10 minutes on the question in its entirety. My quotations are short and precise, my analysis is detailed and perceptive, going beyond the literal meaning of the words and exploring the connotations, but keeping that contextualized to the specifics of this extract. There's nothing vague and generalized. Well, if you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can see I've got a guide to English language, which I'll link in the description. And I'm thinking of working on more videos in this series, so if you'd like that, then make sure you do give it a thumbs up. You might also want to have a go at answering this question yourself and put your answer in the comments section for other students to have a look at.